When I speak to you today, I want you to pause and ask yourself, what happens when your eyes begin to see what the world refuses to acknowledge? What burden does the soul carry when it perceives truths others deny or dismiss? Carl Jung once reminded us that the greatest danger is not in the shadows themselves, but in the isolation of the one who dares to see them. To see what others don't is both a gift and a curse, because it sets you apart, and with that separation comes the weight of misunderstanding, resistance, even hostility. But within that danger lies the deepest possibility for transformation, for it is in confronting the unseen, in naming the hidden, that humanity is pushed toward its evolution. Today, we will journey into this space together. The peril of vision, the solitude of insight, and the profound responsibility of perceiving the unseen. To see what others cannot, or perhaps will not, is not merely a matter of intellectual awareness, but a profound existential confrontation. The individual who perceives truths unseen by the collective is forced into a space of exile, both internal and external, where the fabric of belonging begins to fray. Human beings are wired for connection, for shared perception, for validation, that their experiences mirror those of the group. But when one person's vision pierces through the illusions, deceptions, or unconscious denials maintained by society, that individual becomes a mirror others resist looking into. This isolation is not just social, it is psychological. It pulls at the very roots of identity, for identity is so often affirmed through the eyes of others. When those eyes are filled with suspicion, denial, or outright rejection, the person who sees differently must wrestle with the reality of being both awakened and alienated. In Jungian thought, this situation can be likened to the archetype of the seer, the prophet, or the outsider who hears whispers of the unconscious long before others are ready to listen. The burden here is heavy because the insight itself demands acknowledgement, yet the collective psyche, which clings to comfort and familiarity, often refuses to grant it. This tension between the one who sees and the many who do not creates a split in the psyche of the individual. On the one hand, there is the conviction that what they perceive is real, undeniable, and transformative. On the other, there is the gnawing fear that perhaps they are deluded, that isolation itself is proof of madness, not of vision. This psychological burden manifests in loneliness, depression, or even persecution, not because the insight is false, but because it is premature, ahead of its time, or threatening to the fragile structures of collective belief. Consider history's treatment of visionaries. Many who have glimpsed truths ahead of their era, whether in science, spirituality, or psychology, have been mocked, marginalized, or even destroyed by the very societies that later celebrated them. This pattern echoes a deep psychological truth. Humanity resists change until it can no longer avoid it, and those who see too soon become scapegoats for the fear of transformation. Jung himself experienced this when his explorations of the unconscious, his emphasis on dreams, archetypes, and the shadow set him apart from the dominant rationalism of his time. To carry insight is to carry a cross of sorts, because the gift of vision does not bring immediate acceptance, but often prolonged rejection. The isolation of such individuals is therefore not incidental. It is structural, a byproduct of the gap between the inner unveiling of truth and the outer readiness of society to integrate it. This burden is intensified by the fact that the collective does not merely passively ignore new insights. It actively resists them. The psyche defends itself against disruptive truth through denial, projection, or hostility. When someone points to the shadow lurking beneath social norms, when they expose hypocrisy or bring unconscious content into light, the response of the group is not gratitude but anger. To see what others don't is to disturb the status quo, and those invested in maintaining illusions will label the seer as dangerous. This labeling serves a psychological function. It protects the collective ego from collapse by discrediting the one who threatens it. Thus, the individual finds themselves not only isolated but targeted, their very difference transformed into evidence of deviance. From the standpoint of inner experience, this situation creates a psychological storm. The individual must endure the paradox of feeling both profoundly certain and profoundly uncertain. They carry a vision that feels undeniable, but the lack of external confirmation gnaws at their sanity. The world seems blind, but the sheer number of blind voices creates doubt. Am I the one who sees, or am I the one who is lost? Jung identified this dynamic as a confrontation with the collective unconscious. Those who touch archetypal truths often struggle, because what they experience has no immediate language or structure within society. They are forced to forge metaphors, images, or frameworks to communicate the ineffable, and in doing so they risk being misunderstood, ridiculed, or silenced. The burden here is not only the vision itself, but the attempt to give it form in a world unprepared to receive it. The isolation becomes spiritual as well as psychological. To see beyond the accepted reality often means losing the comfort of belonging. Families may withdraw, friends may distance themselves, institutions may exclude, leaving the seer to walk a solitary path. This solitude, though painful, is also transformative. Jung often emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, cannot occur without separation from the collective. Yet this separation feels like exile rather than liberation at first. The burden lies in enduring that exile long enough to realize it is a passage rather than a punishment. To walk alone through the wilderness of misunderstanding requires immense inner strength, and not all survive it unscathed. Some retreat back into conformity, burying their vision to regain acceptance. Others collapse under the weight of rejection. Only a few are able to carry the burden long enough for the collective to catch up. The archetype of the outsider is crucial here. In myths and stories, the outsider often possesses special knowledge or a gift, but this gift is misunderstood and feared by the community. Think of Cassandra, cursed to speak the truth, but never be believed. Her story is not just mythology. It is psychology in narrative form, capturing the agony of seeing what others cannot and bearing the double pain of both knowing and being dismissed. The Cassandra figure appears again and again across cultures, testifying to the universal human fear of vision that disrupts. The individual who perceives truths unseen by the collective is forced into a liminal space, neither fully accepted nor fully free. carrying insights that burn within them, but are rejected without. Jung also recognized that such isolation can lead to inflation of the ego if not carefully navigated. The person who sees differently might begin to believe they are chosen, superior, or uniquely enlightened, which creates another kind of danger. The burden of isolation, if not tempered with humility, can distort the psyche. Feeling unrecognized, the individual may cling to the idea that they are misunderstood geniuses, slipping into arrogance or detachment from reality. Thus, the burden is twofold: to bear the isolation without collapsing into despair, and to hold the insight without allowing it to inflate the ego. This balance requires deep inner work, constant reflection, and often guidance, though true guidance is hard to find when the very vision that sets one apart also estranges one from potential mentors or communities. The psychological cost of this burden extends into the body as well. Stress, anxiety, sleeplessness, even illness can emerge from the strain of carrying unseen truths. The individual becomes a container of unintegrated energy, both their own and that of the collective shadow they have touched. Jung warned of the dangers of confronting the unconscious without adequate preparation, because the flood of archetypal material can overwhelm the psyche. Those who see what others don't often struggle with precisely this flood: images, symbols, insights, or intuitions that arrive with force, but without context. Holding this energy alone is exhausting, and without outlets for expression or recognition, it threatens to consume rather than transform. At the heart of this keynote lies the paradox of the burden. To see is to suffer, but not to see is to remain unconscious. The individual who perceives truths unseen by the collective is torn between the cost of their vision and the impossibility of relinquishing it. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once known, it cannot be unknown. The burden is therefore permanent, demanding integration rather than escape. Jung's framework suggests that this burden is also an initiation, a descent into the depths of the psyche that strips away illusions and forces the individual into authenticity. The isolation, though painful, becomes a crucible in which the self is refined if the individual can endure it without breaking. The collective rarely appreciates the seer while they live. Validation often comes posthumously, when society has caught up to what was once resisted. This delayed recognition is part of the tragedy of the burden. The one who sees is condemned to live with misunderstanding, even as their vision plants seeds that later generations harvest. The isolation is therefore not meaningless, though it may feel so. It serves a larger process of collective evolution in which individuals at the margins act as forerunners of change. But for the individual in the moment, this larger meaning offers little solace. They must still face the loneliness, the doubt, weariness of carrying what others deny. And so the burden remains heavy, a weight pressing on both heart and mind, demanding resilience, patience, and courage to bear. The psychological conflict between individual insight and societal denial is one of the most profound tensions a human being can experience. At its core, this conflict arises because truth is rarely welcomed when it disrupts the structures and beliefs upon which a community relies for stability. When an individual perceives a reality that others are not ready to acknowledge. They are thrust into an oppositional relationship with the very fabric of their environment. Their inner world begins to split, caught between the clarity of their insight and the resistance of society, producing a storm of contradictions that can erode even the strongest sense of self. This dynamic is not merely intellectual. It is deeply emotional and existential, because human beings crave belonging and affirmation just as much as they crave authenticity. To hold a truth that isolates you is to be torn between two primal needs: the need to be true to what you have seen, and the need to remain connected to others who cannot accept it. Jung described this as a collision between individuation and the collective psyche. Individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is, requires a confrontation with truths that are often hidden, repressed, or denied by society. Yet the collective psyche resists individuation because it threatens the cohesion of the group. For society to function, it relies on shared norms, myths, and illusions that bind people together. When an individual breaks through those illusions, they expose cracks in the structure that others instinctively defend against. The result is denial on the part of the group, a refusal to acknowledge what the individual sees, coupled with a sense of alienation within the individual, who now feels trapped between loyalty to self and loyalty to community. This psychological conflict becomes unbearable because it strikes at the very heart of identity. To betray what you have seen feels like a betrayal of the soul, yet to affirm it publicly risks losing belonging, safety, and acceptance. This tension often manifests as inner division. The individual may begin to question themselves, oscillating between certainty and self-doubt. In private, their vision feels undeniable, but in public, the weight of denial erodes their confidence. This push and pull can lead to feelings of madness, as though the mind is split in two, one part clinging to the vision, the other desperately longing for validation. Jung recognized that such conflicts are not mere personal struggles, but archetypal dramas playing out within the psyche. The figure of the outcast, the prophet, or the visionary embodies this archetypal tension, showing us how the burden of insight collides with the inertia of the collective. The individual becomes a vessel for unconscious material seeking expression, but society, unwilling to face its shadow, forces that vessel into isolation. Denial is not simply ignorance, it is a defense mechanism. The collective psyche protects itself from truths that could destabilize its identity, much like an individual ego resists confronting the shadow. When someone introduces an unsettling truth, whether it is about human nature, social injustice, or the unconscious forces shaping behavior, the group reacts defensively. It dismisses, ridicules, or even demonizes the messenger. This reaction mirrors the inner defense mechanisms of projection and repression. Just as individuals project their unwanted qualities onto others, societies project their fears onto those who threaten their illusions. The visionary becomes a scapegoat, blamed not for falsehood but for truth that is too disruptive to bear. The psychological conflict here is profound because the individual must navigate not only their own doubts, but also the active hostility of a world determined to silence them. This clash between insight and denial often creates existential loneliness. The individual feels exiled even while standing in the midst of others. Conversations become fraught, relationships strained, because what they have seen cannot be easily expressed without triggering defensiveness. Words fail to bridge the gap, and silence becomes both refuge and prison. Jung wrote about the loneliness of those who have stepped beyond the collective consciousness, describing it as an unavoidable part of individuation. The conflict is not merely external, it seeps into the deepest layers of the psyche, creating feelings of guilt, shame, or fear. Guilt arises from betraying either self or community, shame from being labeled deviant, and fear from the unknown consequences of standing apart. These emotions swirl together, creating an atmosphere of inner turbulence that few can endure without cracks appearing in the psyche. Historically, we see this conflict in figures who challenge prevailing norms. Socrates questioned the assumptions of Athenian society and was condemned to death for corrupting the youth, though his only crime was revealing truths others preferred to ignore. Galileo saw what others could not through his telescope and was forced into silence by the denial of religious authorities. Mystics and reformers throughout history have been excommunicated, imprisoned, or killed for truths that later generations accepted. These examples reveal the timelessness of this psychological conflict. It is not a quirk of certain individuals, but a structural pattern of human existence. Insight comes before acceptance, and denial guards the threshold until society is ready to evolve. The individual who carries insight must therefore endure the crucible of rejection, navigating an inner world torn between knowing and being known. On the personal level, this conflict can manifest in subtle but corrosive ways. Someone who sees the hidden dysfunction in their family may be silenced by denial from parents or siblings, forced to carry the burden of awareness alone. A whistleblower who perceives corruption in an institution may face ostracism or retaliation rather than acknowledgement. An artist who expresses unsettling truths in their work may be dismissed as strange, irrelevant, or dangerous. In each case, the insight is real, but the societal denial creates psychological tension that isolates the individual. They may doubt their sanity, repress their vision to fit in, or double down on their difference, each path carrying its own costs. The conflict is never resolved easily because it is not about who is right or wrong, but about the gap between what is seen and what is collectively bearable. For Jung, the path through this conflict lies in holding the tension rather than resolving it prematurely. The individual must learn to bear the weight of insight without collapsing under it or abandoning it. This requires immense psychological resilience, as well as a willingness to accept solitude, to remain true to what one has seen while also understanding the limits of others' readiness is a delicate balance. If one insists too forcefully, society pushes back harder. If one hides entirely, the soul withers. The work then is to integrate the insight into one's own life, to embody it quietly until circumstances allow it to be shared. Jung often spoke of the need for symbols and myths to bridge the gap between unconscious insight and conscious understanding. Those who see differently must find ways to translate their vision into forms that bypass resistance, planting seeds that can grow slowly within the collective imagination. The psychological conflict is also an opportunity. While denial is painful, it forces the individual to refine their understanding. The lack of external validation drives them inward, deepening their connection to the unconscious, sharpening their discernment, and stripping away illusions of external authority. What begins as conflict may become initiation, pushing the individual toward greater authenticity and inner strength. The loneliness of insight becomes the soil in which individuation takes root, though the process is agonizing. The collective may not accept the vision, but the individual's soul expands through the very act of holding it. The conflict, then, is not merely destructive, it is transformative. It tests whether the insight is superficial or whether it has truly been integrated into the fabric of one's being. Only when the individual has carried it fully can it eventually enter the world in a form the collective can digest. The denial of society, while oppressive, also reflects a deeper truth about human psychology. Change cannot be forced. The collective moves slowly, digesting truths over time, and those who see ahead must accept that their role is not to compel, but to prepare. The psychological conflict then becomes a crucible for patience, humility, and endurance. The visionary must accept rejection without losing themselves, carry loneliness without collapsing into despair, and embody truth without demanding immediate recognition. This is a profoundly difficult path, one that explains why so many either retreat into conformity or become embittered outcasts. But for those who can bear it, the conflict becomes the very means of transformation, both for themselves and eventually for society. At its heart, this conflict reveals the fragility of the human psyche. We long for truth, yet fear it when it disrupts what we know. We crave belonging, yet cannot bear those who show us the cost of our illusions. The individual caught in this conflict embodies the tension between authenticity and conformity, between inner vision and outer denial. Their struggle is not just personal, but archetypal, reflecting the eternal drama of human evolution. Every step forward in consciousness has been born of such conflicts, carried by individuals who bore truths the world was not yet ready to accept. And though the denial of society wounds deeply, the persistence of insight eventually reshapes the collective, proving that what is denied today may become tomorrow's wisdom. The transformative responsibility of carrying and integrating hidden knowledge is among the greatest tasks an individual can face, because it is not simply about having access to something unseen, but about embodying it in a way that does not destroy the psyche. Jung often reminded us that knowledge of the unconscious, of the archetypes, of the shadow and the deeper layers of reality is never neutral. It is charged with psychic energy, with a potency that can either break or build. To encounter truths that others do not see places the individual at a crossroads where the choice is not only whether to speak or remain silent, but whether to integrate or to be consumed. This responsibility arises because knowledge alone is not enough. Without integration, it becomes chaos, fragmentation, or inflation. But with integration, it becomes transformation, both for the individual and eventually for the collective. To carry hidden knowledge means holding the weight of something larger than oneself. It is not simply intellectual information, but psychic reality. And as such, it presses upon the one who perceives it. Jung understood this as the danger of archetypal possession, where the human ego is overwhelmed by the immensity of unconscious forces. When someone perceives truths unseen by others, they risk being overtaken by the archetype itself, confusing their personal identity with the transpersonal content they carry. This is why prophets, mystics, and visionaries often walk the fine line between genius and madness. The responsibility is to hold the knowledge without losing oneself in it, to allow it to inform life without collapsing into identification with it. Integration becomes the key, finding ways to weave the insight into the fabric of daily existence so that it does not remain a foreign or alien presence within the psyche. This responsibility is transformative because it forces the individual into a deeper process of individuation. To integrate hidden knowledge means confronting one's own shadow, limitations, and vulnerabilities. The temptation when carrying profound insight is to elevate oneself above others, to believe that possession of truth grants superiority. But Jung warned that this path leads to inflation, to the ego swelling with borrowed power until it collapses under its own weight. True transformation comes only when the knowledge is lived rather than wielded, when it is digested into humility and compassion rather than weaponized into arrogance. The one who carries hidden truths must therefore continually return to the discipline of self-examination, asking whether they are serving the knowledge or merely using it to serve themselves. This responsibility also carries a moral dimension. To see what others do not is to be confronted with a choice. What do you do with this knowledge? Silence may protect the individual, but can leave others vulnerable. Speaking may serve the collective, but may also bring persecution. The responsibility lies in discerning when, how, and to whom the knowledge should be revealed. Timing becomes crucial, for the collective is rarely ready to receive truths all at once. The responsibility is not to force awakening, but to plant seeds, to embody the truth in a way that allows others to approach it at their own pace. Jung understood that symbols and myths serve this function, providing images that mediate the raw power of the unconscious, making it accessible without overwhelming. Those who carry hidden knowledge must learn the art of translation, turning ineffable experiences into forms that invite reflection rather than resistance. The transformative power of this responsibility lies in the demand that it makes upon the individual's life. One cannot carry such knowledge without being changed by it. It calls for sacrifice, for letting go of old identities and comforts. It demands courage because the path of integration often leads through loneliness and misunderstanding. It requires patience because transformation unfolds slowly both within the self and within the collective. The one who carries hidden truths becomes a bridge between worlds, holding in their being the tension between what is and what could be. This bridging role is not glamorous but arduous, for it involves constant negotiation between the demands of the inner world and the resistance of the outer. Yet in that very negotiation, the individual is reshaped, expanded, deepened, becoming more fully themselves than they could have been otherwise. The responsibility is also collective in scope. Though the individual bears the immediate weight, the knowledge itself belongs not only to them, but to humanity. Jung's work with the unconscious revealed that what emerges in one psyche often reflects the larger needs of the collective psyche. Hidden knowledge surfaces through individuals because the collective is in need of it, even if it cannot yet consciously acknowledge this need. The responsibility then is to carry it not as a private possession, but as a stewardship for the whole. This reframing helps prevent ego inflation, reminding the individual that they are not the source, but the vessel. They carry it for others, and in carrying it faithfully, they contribute to the slow evolution of consciousness. The transformative nature of this responsibility is revealed in the way it reshapes perception. Once one has seen beyond the veil, life can no longer be lived superficially. Every action, every relationship, every decision is touched by the awareness of deeper truths. This can be disorienting, even burdensome, but it also brings profound meaning. Responsibility transforms ordinary existence into sacred ground, because one knows that behind the visible lies the invisible, behind the personal lies the archetypal. This shift in perspective is not reversible. To carry hidden knowledge is to live in two worlds at once, and the challenge is to allow them to inform each other without collapsing into either illusion or despair. There is also a responsibility toward one's own psyche. Hidden knowledge is powerful, but if it is not integrated, it can fragment the self. Jung warned of the dangers of premature confrontation with the unconscious, emphasizing the need for gradual assimilation. The responsibility is therefore not only external towards society, but internal toward the integrity of the self. To rush the process, to expose oneself to more than can be integrated, risks breakdown. To deny the process, to bury the knowledge, risks stagnation. The transformative path lies in balancing exposure and assimilation, in allowing the psyche to digest at its own pace. This requires discipline, practices that ground and center the individual, whether through creative expression, reflection, or ritual. The responsibility is to care for the vessel so that it can continue to carry what has been entrusted to it. The archetype of the wounded healer illuminates this responsibility. Those who carry hidden knowledge often do so through their own suffering, through wounds that open them to realities others avoid. Their responsibility is not to escape those wounds, but to transmute them into sources of healing for themselves and for others. This transformation is never easy. It demands endurance, humility, and a willingness to confront pain. Yet it is precisely in embracing this responsibility that hidden knowledge becomes more than a burden. It becomes a gift, a source of wisdom that can guide not only the individual, but the community. The healer does not deny their wounds, but uses them as pathways to compassion, showing others that what was once unbearable can be integrated, and what was once hidden can become a source of light. This transformative responsibility is also marked by paradox. On the one hand, the knowledge sets the individual apart, isolating them from those who cannot see. On the other, it binds them more deeply to humanity because they carry something meant for the whole. The paradox must be endured rather than resolved. To live with hidden knowledge is to live with contradiction, to be both burdened and blessed, both isolated and connected, both humbled and empowered. The transformative element lies in embracing this paradox, allowing it to shape the soul into greater wholeness. Jung often spoke of the need to hold the tension of opposites, and here the responsibility of carrying hidden truths embodies that principle. It is not about choosing one side or the other, but about inhabiting the space between, where transformation occurs. Over time, the responsibility of carrying hidden knowledge can become a source of quiet strength. The initial shock and burden give way to a deeper sense of purpose. The individual begins to see themselves not as cursed, but as entrusted. Their life takes on a mythic dimension, not in the sense of grandiosity, but in the sense of participating in a larger story. The integration of hidden knowledge becomes their contribution to the unfolding of human consciousness. Though the path remains difficult, it also becomes meaningful, because the responsibility has reshaped them into someone capable of bearing it. This is the essence of transformation. The knowledge does not change, but the one who carries it does, becoming not merely a seer, but a bearer, not merely a knower, but a transformer of life itself.